Good evening, everybody. My name is Valerie Forbes, and I am the Dean of the Charles E. Schmidt College of Science here at FAU. Welcome to our latest Frontiers in Science panel, which has the topic this evening of future-proofing our coasts, leveraging science for a sustainable tomorrow in the face of climate change. As many of you know, Frontiers is a program run out of the College of Science that brings together experts from within and outside the university to discuss timely scientific topics with each other and share them with our local community and members of the broader public. And we've been providing Frontiers for close to 2 decades now, and it's become a pillar for communicating and engaging in the sciences within our community. We offer discussions on topics of great public interest with leading experts, and it's made possible by the generous donations of our attendees. So, back to the topic of tonight's discussion. As a science college situated on the southeast coast of Florida, we have a strong group of scientists across many disciplines working on environment-related issues, and we happen to have some of them on this stage tonight. In fact, we just created the new School of Environmental, Coastal, and Ocean Sustainability, which we call ECOS for short, because that is a mouthful, to form a comprehensive hub for all of Florida Atlantic's environmental work, because the environment, and that is both the built environment that we create and the natural environment on which all life depends, and interactions between these two are so important to the future of South Florida and the world. We often say that we're on the front lines of climate change in Florida, from increasingly frequent and severe hurricanes, extreme flooding events, increases in heat-related illness and death in many species, including our own. The impacts of climate change are pretty hard to ignore. I look forward to hearing our panelists' perspectives on how we can address the threats of climate change to ensure we truly do have a sustainable tomorrow. So before I ask our panelists to introduce themselves, I want to let you know that we will be using a service called Slido to take audience questions. Those of you who've been here before know the drill. Please follow the instructions that are on the screen, and there are some handouts in the back. And so you type your questions into the app, and we take them at the end. You can also like or upvote other people's questions, and they'll move up to the top of the queue. So while we encourage you to pose questions to the audience using your phone, I would ask you to put them on silent so they don't happen to go off during the discussion. And please, there'll be a reception next door after the event, so you're all invited to come and interact with our speakers and each other, so you can look forward to that at the end. So next, I want to welcome our panelists, and I will ask them to introduce themselves, and I would ask you to each simply tell us your name, your current position, your area of expertise, and a consequence of climate change that concerns you the most. We'll start here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Serena Herman. I'm acting as interim director for the Center for Urban and Environmental Solutions here in the College of Science at FAU. I am working these days on transportation options, sustainable transportation options, an area of concern when it comes to resilience. I would just say that resilience is way more than reacting to climate change, and I would like to see a more integrated approach toward thinking about resilient systems.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer.
Hi, Dr. Jennifer Hirado. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for Broward County and Deputy Director for our Resilient Environment Department. My background's in water resources, but everything I work on is environment, climate, and resilience these days. And I would say that my greatest concern about the challenges of climate change is really the impacts to people, economics, mental health, public health, just ultimately what it means for individuals in our community.
Okay, thank you. Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Dr. Stephanie Wakefield. I'm assistant professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning here at FAU. And I'm an urban geographer. My research and my teaching largely focus on urban resilience, experimental infrastructures for responding to environmental change, and I'm extremely interested in how we can build and design nature into urban life. When it comes to climate change, I'm most interested in how it can provide an opportunity for transforming cities for the better, for people and for nature. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Weibo Liu, Associate Professor from Department of Geosciences here at FAU. My research mainly focuses on GIS, Geographic Information Science, and also spatial temporal data modeling, and also the applications of GIS and remote sensing to coastal environment, natural hazards, and urbanization. For the climate change, which concerns the most is the biodiversity for the sea level rises, climate change, and also the rising temperatures. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, let's launch right in. So my first question is on the theme of what resilience looks like to you, and I'd like each of our panelists to answer this question from your own perspective. So tonight we're not discussing about reversing or suddenly stopping climate change or its symptoms such as more severe and frequent hurricanes or sea level rise, but we're going to be talking about mitigating the worst impacts and how we can build resiliency into our culture, communities, and policymaking in South Florida. So my question is, briefly, what is your vision for a resilient Southeast Florida in the face of sea level rise and climate change? And what are the most critical steps to take to achieve that vision? And we'll go in order here. So, Serena.
Okay, so we used to think about resilience in a more reactive way. We were planning what we would do when a big hurricane, for example, came to our region. And increasingly, resilience is about looking how systems can be prepared for changing environments, for climate change, how we can look ahead toward preventing disasters, for communities to have the capacity to absorb changes to their systems. And so what we can do going forward is to think about how and where we build our housing so that people have affordable housing, how we plan our housing in relation to our transportation systems so that people have options about how they travel around South Florida. I'd like to see, as mentioned before, these systems become more integrated so that we plan and look ahead in a more integrated way.
Great, thank you. Jennifer, your vision for resiliency.
We're going to run into, whoops, I turned it off. We're going to run into the problem where we are redundant and repetitive. So ultimately, I think it's about focusing holistically on risk reduction. And we are never going to avoid risk, but it is about reducing the magnitude of the impacts, ideally the frequency at which those impacts occur, the duration of those impacts, and the consequences of those impacts. So again, we won't eliminate risk altogether, but it does require an integrated approach to systems planning. It cannot be a haphazard approach. It can't be a series of projects that we all hope work together if they're designed appropriately. It has to actually be a plan that's designed to work together. It needs to be fully reflective of a softened environment with more green infrastructure, with every investment that's delivering co-benefits, not standalone pieces of infrastructure, but it is the systems approach, and I think that's what we need to be working towards.
Okay,
with
great.
Distributed water storage.
Okay, great, thank you. Stephanie.
So I'm very interested in the idea of transformative resilience, and this is kind of an emerging area of research and practice in the urban resilience world. And the idea behind transformative resilience is that we can do more than just bounce back from disasters. We can bounce forward, as it were, to a better state as cities, as communities, and so on. And I'm interested in exploring what that looks like in South Florida. I think we're already kind of starting to embrace that ethos of resilience here in the region. And I would love to see if we were able to pursue transformative resilience here in the future, a resilient South Florida that is a really thriving in an economic, environmental, and cultural way, a thriving aqua-urban region where people and nature are even more interconnected, and nature becomes much more of a part of everyday life, and is able to be part of improving our vitality, our happiness, and regenerating ecosystems. And I'll just say, I think a big part of that is restoring the Everglades.
Great, thank you. Weibo.
Yeah. My students and I did a research which is mirroring the community disaster resilience in the conterminous coastal U.S. And in this research, we define the resilience as the ability of a community to cope with the disaster, to better cope with the disaster by reducing the vulnerabilities. So that means the highly resilient communities could better deal with the disasters, including the hurricanes, tornadoes, floodings, and so on. And we considered 6 components, including the social, economic, infrastructure, institutional, community, and environment. For the coastal environment here, I think the most important part is infrastructure, such like the major roads, bridges, to improve our resilience. And also, we could improve our health insurance to cover to improve our resilience. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So my next question is directed specifically towards Serena. Serena, your research focuses on, among several topics, how we experience climate change and the power of technology, such as virtual reality, for engaging with the public, local governments, and policymakers, as well as sustainable transportation. So I want to ask you, what are the biggest challenges in building resilient communities in the face of climate change, and how can we integrate sustainable transportation solutions to create truly sustainable and equitable cities?
Thank you. That's a big question in 2 parts, I think. So let's try part 1. I am excited about working with virtual reality with communities because one hurdle we have in moving forward is being able to imagine things we haven't seen before. So we have seen on the news, and sadly, ever more frequently, we have seen these rain events and these storm events where we have seen water in our streets. So sadly, more and more of us can imagine what 2 feet of water looks like, or even more, in our streets. So part of it is imagining what can happen, but even more importantly, with virtual reality, we can, and other immersive technologies, we can start to imagine how to respond to these challenges. And I think we probably all know what virtual reality is, right? You put on a pair of goggles, you are transported to another place. You're hear and see and experience a place, and it actually tricks your brain into thinking that you are sitting in this other context. So by waking up our imaginations, by engaging in a way that is hopeful, that people feel like they have a way forward, that they can imagine what we can do. In the goggles, we don't just show flooding, we also show, for example, a seawall. Sometimes we're picturing a seawall being something that obstructs our view of the water. It's objectionable, we don't want that. When you see a properly constructed seawall, you see that it goes 30 feet down underground. It's mostly invisible. The land is built up behind it to support it. That's when it's properly constructed. But even better than that, you can add on to this kind of infrastructure and provide more recreational spaces. You could plan in a bike path along this wall. You could even add an artificial island and extend opportunities for recreation. So just waking up the imagination, what is possible, and involving everyone to participate in these solutions. The second part about sustainable transportation is that I'd like people to have options. So we are all stuck in traffic quite a bit in South Florida. Not all of us is riding in a car our preferred choice to get around the region. I would love to see more options for people, and people who cannot drive or choose not to drive for whatever reason, that they also can participate in a workforce. They also can evacuate in the case of a disaster. So the sustainable transportation question, it goes to providing more kinds of transportation in places that people need them, and also getting people all the way from their homes to their jobs or schools or doctor's visits. It's great to provide buses and trains and so forth, but we also need to get people to those locations where public transportation is available. So a sustainable system not only is friendly to the environment because we are reducing fossil fuels, but it's also providing a better quality of life and more economic stability for many people.
Do any of the rest of the panelists have any thoughts on transportation in particular? You don't have to, but I thought I'd put that out there.
I would just throw out one other thought. You know, Serena mentioned imagination, and I think this is a really big. You asked what was one of the biggest impediments or hurdles to thinking about resilience, and I think sometimes it's our own imaginations, because we're so accustomed to thinking that tomorrow will be like today. And the turn to thinking about resilience and climate futures has really enabled us to open our imaginations to the possibility that things could be radically different tomorrow, or in the longer term future, and that we could design things to be very different. One of the things that I think tends to lock us in is our built environment. So we have a built environment that encourages, car transportation primarily, but also walkability is such an important solution, I think, too, right now, both to thinking about climate change, but also human health. So building in green trails, nature trails, sidewalks, things like this, I think is very important too.
Agree. All right. Thank you. Let us go on to Jennifer. So, Jennifer, your work as the Chief Resilience Officer for Broward County involves facing complex challenges such as sea level rise and putting science, policy, and planning to action for one of the largest and most affected counties for climate change in the state. So, what policy changes do you think are needed at the local, regional, and state levels to incentivize adaptation and resilience measures, and how can we empower communities to take ownership of their resilience planning and implementation efforts?
Okay, well, there's a lot to that question as well. And I think I want to start, though, by not beginning with the incentivization, because I think there's a lot that we just need to simply embed in the requirements for policy and regulation. And so we've been working for multiple years, and in fact just finalized a countywide resilience plan focused on the existing landscape. But before we do any of that, I think has been the acknowledgement that every dollar spent is one wasted if it's not reflecting resilience considerations. And so we had to go back and amend all of our development requirements for surface water management, drainage, flood control, seawalls, finished floor elevations to incorporate sea level rise, plus rainfall intensification, to incorporate those plus king tides, those plus groundwater table rise. Our water management circumstance is very, very complex. So, that was the first step. The next step is to recognize that not every aspect of our community is going to be redeveloped overnight. And yes, we may end up and hopefully end up with these incredible, visions of a transformed community, but that's stepwise. So how do you get there in the increment? Because in the meantime, we're flooding, and there's flood losses and real impacts to people, losses of their vehicle, damage to their home, and inability to work for a number of reasons. And so, working towards the whole landscape, we have to recover storage in our system, which is huge. We have to find a place to put the water. And where we're built out, and I know all of our communities look different, we're built to different levels, but some of us have a lot of impervious, and it's hot and uncomfortable in addition to flooding. So, storage and green infrastructure is going to be critical to addressing heat and flooding in those communities now. And movement of water through the canals, below ground storage, keeping water at bay with higher seawalls, all those things are part of the picture. So we need to embed that in the way that we plan for the infrastructure improvements that can achieve those things. Some of this is also about recognizing that every single land use decision has implications for the existing community. It really does, especially if you're not already embedding future conditions or requirements. But everything that we model today, like if you've got like a golf course, that's where you're already storing a lot of water. If you alter that, you have to accomplish not only the loss of storage someplace else while you plan for that change in the future condition. And so the incentives can be achieved through leveraging land use development. If you consider that an entitlement, what are you going to deliver in the way of a net benefit to the community for the benefit of developing the property? I think that we need to achieve those, and we need to see more of community benefits being part of organized redevelopment plans. Because if we don't achieve it with each one of those projects, then you're saddling the remaining community. There's no storage there. We have already established that. So if you don't achieve it at the time that redevelopment is taking place, or incentivize, which you could with greater development opportunities, and less parking could be an incentive to create more storage in the landscape at the time of redevelopment. But I think part of it is just mandatory, what are we going to require? And the second is, what will be the net benefit that you can deliver through a redevelopment and economic opportunity that this community can afford? And those are the things I think that we really need to work towards, because the demands are so great. And in the work that we've done, about 70% of what is going to happen and needs to happen in the way of resilient investment will come from the private sector, will be commercial properties and individual residential properties where we're going to have to recover swales. We may have to cede some of the right-of-way. We're going to have to give up, and there's opportunities for the private sector to participate in those things too. So again, you need to have a comprehensive plan. You need to know what that endpoint and the target looks like, and then that gives you something to work towards. But if you don't have a plan, how do you know what opportunities you're missing? Because you couldn't ask the right question.
And how do you engage the public or the community in this work?
Well,
how do you involve them?
I think that the types of visualizations that Serena shared are important. In our case, we've developed an online platform that allows the community to see the landscape through a variety of sea level rise and climate scenarios. We've put in place what the adaptation scenarios will deliver, so you can look at your own community and appreciate what that'll provide. And the community needs that information because they need to be able to participate in the process. And so they need to be able to challenge, what does this project mean in our community? I've looked at the results. I know what the water storage needs. How is that going to affect my backyard? What else is my city doing to invest? So you have to present that information and allow for collective knowledge, because if it's only happening in an isolated office, and if that person's not there, then the question's not asked, well, that doesn't work either.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this topic from any of the other panelists?
I was just glad that you brought up corporate partnerships, and that can also happen in other areas like transportation. There is a project ongoing in West Palm Beach where employers, through an organization called WPB Go, they are working with employers to provide like transit passes, incentivizing people to try out other ways to get to work. Maybe think it's a small step on the way, but this is the way change happens sometimes. It's with these small steps, and it is with all partners involved.
Okay, that's wonderful. All right, I'm going to move on to Stephanie. So, Stephanie, your research intersects urban geography, design, and environmental science, and spotlights the many opportunities for resilience building in coastal cities. Your studies advocate for framing resilience as an innovative planning paradigm based in reconnecting cities with natural environments, as you talked about in your introduction, and harnessing rather than eliminating nature's inherent vital capacities. So my question to you is, what are the most critical research gaps that need to be addressed to advance our understanding of urban resilience and climate change adaptation? how can we balance the need for effective infrastructure solutions with the aesthetic and social value of urban green spaces and natural environments?
It's an amazing question, or set of questions. Thank you. So, to me, one of the most interesting things that I have seen in my work and in my teaching over the last decade or so is the way in which the turn towards building urban resilience has involved a sort of subtle shift in how we think about infrastructure. Traditionally, you think of infrastructure, roads, bridges, train tracks, things like this, electricity grids. But increasingly, as we talk about the need to build resilience in cities and to deal with climate change, more and more we see in the urban planning and design field an embrace of the idea that cities are these interconnected social ecological systems made up of people and nature that are interconnected. And this really, in some ways, goes against the way that we are used to thinking about cities. We're used to thinking of that there's like a cultural area and then there's nature over there. Similarly, it transforms how we think about infrastructure, because more and more we are now talking about nature as infrastructure. Ecosystem services is a term you hear a lot. Nature-based solutions is another term you hear a lot. And this area of designing nature to benefit cities, to mitigate risk, to fulfill certain functions is really an exciting and emerging area of research where there's still so much to do. And so, on a conceptual level, it's a question of, what do we even mean by some of these terms? And how do we value nature's services? We could say, okay, ecosystems, nature can mitigate environmental hazards. So oyster reefs or tidal flats, things like this, they can buffer storm surge and flooding and lessen its impact on the coast. We could say that tree canopies reduce extreme heat that comes, especially in South Florida, in highly concrete and steel cities. So it has this risk mitigating, nature has this risk mitigating ability. We can also quantify that and create economic valuations. And we're seeing more and more of this. For example, with Everglades, we have the ability to estimate the monetary value of wetlands' ability to filter water, for example. And so these are some areas of emerging research. I think there's still so much to be done also to evaluate the efficacy of nature-based infrastructure. How efficient is it at buffering storm surge? And so we need to do comparative studies as well between hard infrastructure and nature-based infrastructure. And I think it's important to emphasize it's really never a matter of saying, oh, we're replacing gray infrastructure, right? Gray infrastructure meaning the traditional thinking of infrastructure as like a concrete seawall, for example. We're not trying to replace them, but they're a nice complement to each other. And Dr. Diana Matova, actually, in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, has done some amazing work creating tools for thinking about, well, which kinds of, for example, shorelines, living shorelines, hard seawalls are appropriate to different coastal areas, because it's really a matter of figuring out what fits best where, depending on the environment. And I think that more and more going forward, we're going to need more studies around that and more trials of nature-based infrastructure, but also to embrace the idea that that nature can provide even more, not just risk mitigation, but also a means of regeneration, like I mentioned before, both for, if we redesign habitats, we bring back to life a lot of nature that gets sometimes lost and destroyed in the urban development process. Nature can also really improve the mental and physical health outcomes for people in cities. And so we're starting to see more studies showing, for example, the ability of green spaces in cities to lower cortisol levels in urban residents, so stress and anxiety levels, to have positive impacts on Alzheimer's and dementia, for example, depression, things like this. So nature has these therapeutic benefits as well. So I think it's very interesting to embrace the idea of biophilic urban design. This is an area of emerging research. And
so what do you mean by biophilic
So
design?
This is such an interesting idea. The idea of biophilia is the idea, comes from E.O. Wilson, a biologist, and it's gained traction in the realm of urban planning and design. Biophilia is the idea that human beings evolved in contact with the living world, and that we thrive most when we're in contact with the living world, the natural world. And so the idea of biophilic urban design is that we can design life and nature and natural environments into our everyday life in cities, whether through things like parks and green spaces, green roofs, water features, all these types, or tree canopies, urban forests, all these types of nature into cities as a means of increasing the vitality of cities, increasing the quality of life for people and nature in cities. So this is an area I think is very exciting for research going forward. And I think it's really cool how many different people we have here at FAU and even in ECO specifically who are working on different aspects of this kind of nature-based approach. And so I hope that we can kind of really push forward and lead on this theme of nature as infrastructure.
Ties in nicely to last month's panel on healthy aging.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Any other comments on this topic while we're here?
Yeah, I think mainly the research gap for the urban, because I'm only doing GIS, so in order to build a resilient urban, I think the data is, for me, is a gap to some extent, and all the models, because we want to gather the high resolution images, maybe the sensors or UAVs, to better model the urban system. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, Weibo, let's stick with you then. So you study the link between urban expansion and tidal flat loss. Now, tidal flats are coastal wetlands that protect against the destructive powers of the ocean, such as hurricanes, and they're under threat due to sea level rise and rapid urbanization. Now, in Southeast Florida, we are facing increasing challenges due to massive population growth that is expanding into what were previously low-lying areas like wetlands and along our coastal waterways. So my question for you is, what ecosystem services do tidal flats provide? Actually, this is 3 questions, so I'm kind of cheating. What are the potential consequences of tidal flat erosion for the communities and ecosystems of Southeast Florida, especially in the face of rising sea levels? And what does that mean for the average person living in South Florida?
Good, thank you for your questions. Yeah, the tidal flats play a very important role protecting the lands from the tides or floodings due to the hurricanes, tsunamis, tidal currents, waves, and so on. And also, the tidal flats could bring a lot of economic benefits to the residents in the coastal area, for example, the fishery and aquaculture. However, nowadays, the tidal flats experience increasing pressure due to the urban expansion and also the sea level rise, because the tidal flats is a major land source for the urban expansion. And also the urban waste, there is so much urban waste to the ocean, so it will increase the environment of the tidal flats, will damage the tidal flats. So for my research, I mainly use the GIS and remote sensing images, the satellite images, land site, to study the tidal flats. Firstly, we identify the tidal flats from 1984 to 2020, almost 30 years, to see their spatial temporal changes. And we did see there's a big decrease or the loss of the tidal flats. And combining the previous research, we found that there is almost a 16% decrease from the 1984 to 2016 over the global level of the tidal flats. So, like Valerie said, what's the damages to average people? For the loss with tidal flats, because we will lose a buffer, like Stephanie said, we lose a buffer between the ocean and the land. So losing the tidal flats, it will as a counterforce or the natural hazards, it will damage our coastal communities, especially the densely populated communities. So we could say there are two phases of pressure tidal floods. One side is the inland, the urban expansion, the human activities. Another side is the ocean, from the sea level rise. Because we cannot control the inundation of the oceans, right? So the sea level rise is an inevitable phenomenon. So from our research, I think it's better to limit the urbanization process or to limit the urban buildings along the shoreline to have the sufficient buffer area for the tidal floods to have the tidal floods migrate to the inland areas. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Anybody have additional comments on that? Or we will maybe no, or we can.
Yeah,
Go.
I would just say that, not necessarily the tidal flat, but the concept of, our beaches and what we need to do for the purpose of migration, and that we do need to be cognizant of what our footprint looks like today, and when were our standards last developed, guiding what we thought to be a very permanent sort of circumstance, because we, model what storm surge looks like, and you create a coastal construction line that makes sure that you don't, develop further waterward of that. But when your seas are rising and your storm surge is increasing, the coastal construction line is no longer the boundary of what's protective. And again, not to say that you abandon things immediately, but as we think about redevelopment, how do you create space for that shifting of the shoreline? And for us, it may be sea turtle nesting habitat and other shorebirds and so forth. And we don't want to see that hardened. We want it to be soft and mobile, and it is a critical buffer to protecting, same way, our coastal infrastructure. And so I think there's many similarities between the tidal flat circumstance and just our overall consideration for how we treat our shorelines.
I'll just add one little thing. There was a question a minute ago that you had about how can communities and residents be involved and take ownership over the resilience building process. And the tidal flats example actually made me think about this. I think there's some really interesting ways that restoration of shorelines, of tidal flats, of lagoons, of oyster reefs, what have you, can be opportunities for people to learn about their environments and get more connected with their environments by being involved in the restoration process itself. So there are so many really great examples. Where in Venice, for example, they're redoing the Venetian lagoon, and they have all kinds of community involvement in actually replanting the seagrasses, and then using their local knowledge to kind of inform where it goes and taking care of it and becoming sort of stewards of their environment. I used to be involved in oyster restoration in New York, and it's incredible. You would see on a weekend 100 people come out to just help build oyster reefs on their free time, and so these are interesting opportunities too.
Okay, good. Thank you all for that. Those are all my questions. Now we're going to go to the audience questions. So anybody who feels that they want to answer any of these questions, just go ahead. All right, we're going to do the first one, which is an easy one, of course. How do you handle climate change deniers? What steps can we take as a society to combat misinformation? Who wants to tackle that one? The audience may also answer if you know.
It's not a fair question for Broward County because we don't run into that conversation all that often. It's been a long time. It's been flooding regularly for some time. I remember when we first started having some of this conversation with the private sector and prominent forums with leadership, and we were sharing new maps that we were going to use that would show which areas of the county were most subject to sea level rise and the impacts. And somebody got really, agitated and said, you need to be really cautious about sharing maps like that. And someone else said, I live in that neighborhood. I know what it looks like. and those impacts are real. And, back in 2012, someone might say, well, we've always flooded. It's like, okay, 20 years ago you had a flood event. Mm-hmm. Now you've got them every single fall. We would have built our community differently had we been realizing the impacts back then of what we're having now. We have tidal flooding that occurs miles inland. We're losing our drinking water wells. We've had a 1 in 1,000 year rainfall event. 2,000 cars were lost in a single day. So you can discuss whether or not humans are causing it, but the fact that it's happening is what we need to get our arms around. We will never convince everybody of everything, and we don't have to. But there are enough reasons to do the right thing, whether it's economics, energy independence, clean air, flood risk reduction, economic vitality, innovation, leading on new technologies. There are so many reasons to move in the right direction that we do not allow ourselves to get caught up in a conversation that's, frankly, it's not going to go anywhere. But we can also have the conversation based upon anything that's important to someone. If public health is interest to a person, we can talk about climate with respect to public health. Whatever the subject is, there's a relationship. So it's been a long time. Sometimes you run into it, but there's really no value, in my opinion, of trying to beat someone into thinking exactly the way that you do. And again, hopefully there's enough of us that are recognizing what needs to get done, that moves us collectively in the direction we need to go. And events need to be utilized as a reminder and to our benefit in terms of we can't allow this to happen again.
I mean, what about on this issue of misinformation, which is kind of a separate issue, where now more and more people are getting their news from social media or influencers, and it's getting kind of hard to control. And we as scientists, what can we do to sort of combat that trend?
I think it does, again, go to the things we can agree on. When I receive at home in the mail notice that my homeowner's insurance is not going to be renewed or is doubling, or these are things that we can agree on. These are issues that we can hopefully find common ground. Okay, what do we want to do about this? How do we want to address the greater issues on things that we see that we can agree on?
I would just say to that also, as a teacher, I think one of the important things right now is to teach our students and ourselves, frankly, to be critical thinkers and to be able to think critically about the information that we receive, the media that we imbibe, and to fact check everything that we see, before we share a meme, of the Statue of Liberty underwater or something like this, and it's a skill. It's a skill. It's like a survival skill, I think, increasingly that we all need, and that can be taught in schools too. I think it's very, very important.
Okay. All right. Thank you. We'll go to the next question. What is the most impactful change that communities, small and large, can make without massive monetary investments to help reduce the effects of climate change?
So should we approach that from an energy standpoint? Is that where the question, or could it be impacts, meaning so it's not that the conditions won't be as severe, or the impacts themselves won't be as severe? So
I'm not sure. What is the most impactful change that communities, small and large, can make without massive monetary investments to help reduce the effects of climate change?
So I would say the most fundamental thing that we can do as people is look at consumerism, frankly, in terms of what we do that drives energy practices and demands. I think it's tragic when you look at how much waste we have in our communities and how easy it is to purchase and dispose of items and never think about it again.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a critical area. There are clearly small things that we can do in terms of choice of, plastic or not. And when the next time we get a vehicle, you have to buy a vehicle anyway. Look at the fuel consumption or make it a clean. I'm not saying everybody run out and get a new car today. But every time you're making a new investment, food choice, it's huge, just maybe a little less meat because, they produce a lot of methane. How much do we collectively put into the landfill? There's just so many things that are part of our daily practice.
Yep, good examples there. Any other one?
I could add this sounds very silly at first, but you could plant trees. Okay, that sounds silly because, when we were younger, it was like for Earth Day, you would just plant a tree. That was kind of this thing you did in grade school for in the environment, right? But actually, we, over the last hundreds of years of urbanization, we have covered a lot of our surfaces in impermeable concrete and roads and buildings. And by, bringing back in tree cover to cities, I love cities, I'm not talking about getting rid of them, I just mean adding in trees, we can reduce the heat from being in cities, from being in places like South Florida. We can beautify our cities. We can also then, absorb carbon dioxide a little bit, among the other, services of urban forests. And it's very simple, actually, and can be cost effective.
Yeah. I think maybe we could we call it a smart home, right? So we could use different sensors, like to monitor our AC to use less electricity, right? So different monitors, different sensors. Yeah.
So you can maybe even reduce the cost, not only just not spend massively, but actually have an economic benefit as well. That's good. That's a good point. Okay, so this let me go to this one. It's got a lot of likes. In your opinion, which of the alternative energy models, solar, wind, hydroelectric, can best help reduce our dependence on fossil fuels? All the above?
It needs to be a combination, and it's going to be different solutions for different contexts. But I do agree with the idea, again, about options. So if there is a storm event and you have other options for generating electricity, that's only a good thing. There are some things that we can be doing that are just good things to do. They help the environment, but they're also increasing our standard of living. So we can push forward, even in our homeowners association meeting. Why can't we install solar panels? I would like to have the option to install. We can start with small things like that. Maybe solar panels are more accessible than wind energy for most of us. But a combination, because we need all the solutions we can get.
Okay. I'm going to go to the next one, which is a little bit doom and gloom, but I'll ask it anyway. With increased frequency and intensity of storms and flooding, how much time do we really have left living in South Florida? While you're thinking about that, I remember visiting the Keys for the first time and reading that the highest point above sea level was 17 feet. And you know how narrow the Keys are. I wouldn't move to the Keys right now. Anyway, go ahead.
So we're actively planning for 3.3 feet of sea level rise.
Okay.
And that's aligned with our 2070 time frame. And that assumes 3.3 feet relative to 2000. And currently, we're in a very steep time of what's happening with sea level rise, and we've been on that ramp since about 2012, and we've not seen that rate drop down. Now, I think I think that we will find dramatic improvements on the energy side that will roll out over the next coming decades. that will improve our future. But the point is that there's a lot of rise that's already baked in. We don't know what's going to happen with the rate of ice melt as it relates to the ice sheets, and that's a big unknown. But while there will be areas that we struggle to keep dry, and I will say that beyond 3 feet of sea level rise, there are areas where it's very hard to keep them dry. There will need to be decisions about whether or not those are areas that we continue to occupy, and that doesn't happen overnight, it happens with time. Or you could potentially see in some of those same areas, I'm not advocating for one versus the other, but redevelopment. I mean, as things are happening already, seawalls that were 1 foot aren't being raised to 5 feet outside of redevelopment. People are coming in, they buy the smaller home that sits at a low elevation, they build up the seawall, they bring in fill, and gradually things elevate. And there is an opportunity, a very costly one, to redevelop in that mode if someone is insistent on trying to maintain the same footprint, but that doesn't account for what happens with storms and so forth. And so there is, I don't think we yet know what some of those hurricanes could look like in the future under those conditions, but I would say that we probably expect well to be working within the landscape that we have here, and for the most part through 2100 probably it doesn't change a great deal. Although there will be areas where it's just too soggy, and no matter how much water you pump, you can't keep up with what's happening below ground. And I think that a lot of that will be gradual. So I don't think that there's a time certain when people no longer live here. But what I will say, and it's well documented, the more aggressive we are with emissions reductions, we will see the benefits of those changes in our lifetimes. And yes, it will still be raining hard. The seas will still be rising, but maybe that rainfall intensification isn't 35%, but it's only 25%. So there are things that we can do and will with commitment see the benefits in periods of decades. And then the question is, how aggressive can we be with that and capping the amount of change that occurs?
Okay, great, thank you. Since you're talking about seawalls, there is a question here about seawalls and how exactly they work. So the seawalls that you have on the ocean side, they help protect landward property, but they also can change beach profiles, so they fail dune plants, turtles, birds, and invertebrates. So what are they a good thing? What about costs and benefits of seawalls to the coastline? And how could we make them better?
We don't allow seawalls on the barrier island, and if there is infrastructure where there's a retaining wall, there's a requirement to keep the beach in front of it and to keep dunes in place and so forth. So seawalls in our case are really on the intercoastal side, and that isn't where turtles are nesting. So I would agree that we wouldn't want to armor the beaches to end up with seawalls, and that would not be the direction that would be sustainable.
So better approach for the ocean side are artificial reefs or other structures that might dampen wave activity, right?
Yeah, so a really interesting example that I have done a lot of work on is the Living Breakwaters project in New York City. This is the largest experimental oyster reef as breakwater project that's ever been built. It was just completed, I believe, a year or two ago. It came out of the Rebuild by Design competition, which was funded by the federal government, the Rockefeller Foundation, after Hurricane Sandy in 2012. And the idea is to create sort of reef streets and artificial oyster reefs further out than they normally naturally grow off the coast of Staten Island, in the high wave action areas where they can best mitigate storm surge. And the idea here is, instead of like a hard, solid seawall, you have you mimic nature's shapes, so they're designed out of this ecologically enhanced concrete, which is designed to have a pH different from Portland cement, which is what's normally used in a seawall or a breakwater, and it's designed to recruit biogenic buildup and attachment of life on the outside of it, so that not only can oysters, once they're seeded in there, start to form these reefs with their shells over time, but other aquatic life can also attach on. And the hope, this is an experiment, but the hope is that with that artificial substrate and then the seeding of oysters and other biogenic buildup, that these can sort of grow with sea level rise naturally and form habitat through their different kind of shapes and things like this. So mitigating the impact of the waves, not just stopping it. It's an interesting project, and we're going to watch in real time whether it works and how well it works.
Okay, great. I'm going to take one more, and then we're going to have to close the Q&A. And this is kind of a different topic, but what are some active measures that are being worked on to limit gentrification in the wake of sea level rise along the coast? Any thought? That might be one for you, Serena.
So in other contexts, some things that have worked are to build the capacity of communities to withstand these economic fluctuations. Gentrification is something that does happen in different contexts. We've seen it happen in a different way in Florida, specifically in Miami. There's research that shows that the properties at higher elevation, their property values are accelerating faster than some of the properties that are more at risk. And yet we continue to build in these high-risk areas. So, there's a picture there happening of some folks being pushed out of the higher elevation areas. They tend to be the lower economic level folks because they can't withstand the changes that are happening. And so they could have been pushed out of another area as well. So it's linked to climate change, but it's also part of greater economic forces happening in the region, right? So how do we stabilize communities? Well, it's all of the things about providing just more housing at every level. We really need to get out of this shortage of housing that we have worldwide. It's a very complex issue. There are many reasons why we can't keep up with our housing needs, but that is one challenge that we need to overcome to help with gentrification. We do need to have jobs that people can get to, so that's the transportation factor, because the cost of living in a place is not just the cost of housing, it's also the cost of transportation to get to your job, your school, other places that you need to go. So it's called a wicked problem, affordable housing, because it's very complex and there are many different factors that go into it. So there's really no one solution there, and I'm not an expert on the solutions of gentrification. I've just looked a little bit about some of the mechanisms. We'll need to keep trying. We need to do better, that's for sure.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll end on that note. I know there are more questions, but our panelists will be sticking around for the reception, so please join us next door and you can ask your questions that didn't get taken to them directly. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us tonight and sharing your expertise. That was a great discussion. I also want to make sure to thank all of the College of Science staff who have either been working behind the scenes and or are here tonight to make sure that things run smoothly, because this is most definitely a team effort to pull this off. So thank you all. You know who you are.